There is a man who spent 7 summers checking the ground beneath his own children's feet, not for rocks, not for ant hills. He was checking to see if anyone had dug there. Every year he packed a cooler, loaded his wife and his 2 kids into the car, and drove to the same quiet patch of woods for a picnic. He spread out the same blanket. He watched his children run and laugh a few feet away from him. And every single time, without ever explaining why, he knelt down and studied the dirt beneath them, making sure it hadn't been disturbed. Underneath that dirt was a 16-year-old girl. He had put her there himself, and for 7 years, he lived 200 yards from her grave, raising his family right beside it, while an entire town searched the earth for a girl who was never more than a few minutes' walk from home. This is the story of Kari Lynn Nixon. In the summer of 1987, Au Sable Forks, New York was the kind of town most people only see in old photographs. It sat quietly at the edge of the Adirondack Mountains, a place where the biggest event of the week might be a church picnic or a Little League game. Neighbors knew each other by name. Doors were left unlocked. Kids were allowed to walk to the corner store alone after dark without their parents thinking twice about it. This was not a town that feared the night. Danger, if people thought about it at all, was something that happened somewhere else, in some other town, to some other family. Kari Lynn Nixon was, in every sense, a product of that town. She was 16 years old, an above-average student, a singer, and a girl who told her friends she wanted to be a writer one day. She pitched for her high school softball team. She had deep roots in her community, a family who loved her, and a life that, on the surface, looked entirely safe. There was nothing in her world that suggested trouble was coming, nothing that would have made anyone worry. Her world was small, but it felt secure. And then, in the space of a single evening, that sense of security was destroyed for an entire town, not just for one family. It started with something completely ordinary. On the evening of June the 22nd, 1987, Kari's father asked her to make a quick trip to the local country store to pick up a few groceries. It was the kind of errand she had run dozens of times before. She left her own money sitting on top of her dresser and instead took the $20 her father handed her. Nobody thought anything of it. She walked out of the front door at around 9:30 at night into a warm, ordinary summer evening, and nobody in that house had any idea they were watching her leave for the last time. What happened over the next 40 minutes has been pieced together from witnesses who had no idea at the time that they were watching the final moments of a disappearance that would haunt an entire region for years. The store clerk remembered Kari clearly. She rang her up at just before 10 o'clock that night, a small bill of a little over $3 for groceries. It was such an unremarkable transaction that the clerk only remembered it later because of what came after. Kari left the store and started the short walk home, the same walk she had made countless times before. At around 10 o'clock, a neighbor exchanged a quick, friendly greeting with her, just a short distance from her house. She was close. She was almost home. And then, only a handful of minutes later, a group of teenage boys walked down that same quiet street. In the narrow gap between those two moments, in a stretch of only a few hundred feet, Kari Lynn Nixon disappeared. No scream, no struggle that anyone saw, no trace. When Kari's mother woke up the next morning and discovered that her daughter's bed hadn't been slept in, the fear was immediate and overwhelming. She made frantic phone calls to Kari's friends, hoping for some innocent explanation, hoping she had simply stayed the night somewhere and forgotten to call. There was none. The police were contacted, and what had started as an ordinary summer evening turned, almost overnight, into a nightmare that would consume the entire community. The search that followed was massive. Volunteers from local fire departments, officers from multiple police agencies, and even personnel from a nearby Air Force base joined the effort, combing an area of roughly 50 square miles around the town. They searched open fields. They checked barns, sheds, and outbuildings. They walked the banks of the local river for miles in each direction. And after all of that effort, all of those volunteer hours, all of that hope, they came up with absolutely nothing. Not one piece of physical evidence, not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, not a single credible sighting. For a town that had never had to measure danger in anything but the abstract, that silence was its own kind of horror. There was no crime scene to process, no physical thread to pull, just the last known minutes of a 16-year-old girl's life, and then nothing at all. Investigators, doing their due diligence, briefly considered whether Kari might have run away on her own. It wasn't a theory pulled out of thin air. Friends told police that Kari had written to them more than once about wanting to leave Au Sable Forks behind. First, it was Hawaii. Then it was Florida. Then more recently, she had talked about California once she turned 18 and could go wherever she wanted. For a moment, that gave investigators a thread to pull, but the thread led nowhere. She had no money beyond the $20 her father had given her that night. She had no history of running away. She had left no note, packed no bag, said no goodbyes. There was nothing that pointed to a girl planning her own disappearance. A captain with the New York State Police, who had been closely involved in the investigation from the beginning, said it plainly. As far as he and his team were concerned, Kari Lynn Nixon had been abducted. She hadn't simply vanished into a life of her own choosing. Someone had taken her. The case went cold, but it never went quiet. Over the years that followed, investigators would chase down roughly 70 reported sightings of Kari across the country. They conducted more than 1,500 interviews. They examined over 200 sets of unidentified remains recovered in different states, hoping for a single match that would finally give them an answer, one way or another. None of it ever came. For Kari's parents, those years became an exhausting, brutal cycle of hope, followed by devastation. At one point, an anonymous letter arrived claiming that Kari was alive and living under a different name, hundreds of miles away in South Carolina. The family had no connection to that state whatsoever, and yet they packed up and made the journey anyway, because what if it was true? What if this was the moment it finally ended? Several residents in that town were certain they had seen a girl matching Kari's description. For a short window of time, there was real, tangible hope. And then, just like every lead before it, the trail went cold, and the family made the long trip home with nothing. Then, in the early 1990s, the case took its strangest and most public turn yet, and it had nothing to do with police work at all. It involved a music video. Concert footage filmed a few years earlier had captured a large crowd of fans, and somewhere in that sea of faces, Kari's family became convinced they saw their daughter. They weren't the only ones who noticed the resemblance. Investigators had an enhanced photograph made from the footage and compared it directly against a recent picture of Kari. The similarities were genuinely striking. Hair length, hair color, the shape of her face. Even the specific placement of her earrings matched what was known about Kari, down to the smallest detail. The resemblance was strong enough to reignite hope on a national scale. The case had already been featured on a popular unsolved crime television program a couple of years earlier, and now, with this new lead, the story exploded back into the public eye. Public appeals were made directly to the girl in the video, asking her to come forward if she truly was Kari. For months, a family, a team of investigators, and thousands of strangers who had only heard the story secondhand held their breath together, waiting. The truth, when it finally arrived, was devastating. The young woman in that concert footage was identified and confirmed to be someone else entirely. A woman with a completely different name, a completely different life, and absolutely no connection to Kari's disappearance. The phantom hope that had carried so many people through those months evaporated instantly. For Kari's parents, this wasn't just the end of one lead among many. It was the collapse of the loudest, most public possibility they'd ever had, that their daughter might still be alive somewhere out there, living a life of her own. It quietly confirmed a darker, heavier truth. If Kari wasn't out there living a new life, then the answer to what happened to her wasn't going to come from across the country. It was going to come from somewhere much closer to home. For 7 long years, the case file sat largely untouched, growing colder with each passing season. Then, in January of 1994, the break finally came, and it arrived from a direction nobody had expected. Police arrested a 29-year-old man named Robert Anthony Jones in connection with a string of bank robberies. Jones was originally from Au Sable Forks, the very same town Kari had vanished from, though by the time of his arrest he was living hundreds of miles away. As it happened, he had been back in town for a brief family visit during the exact week Kari disappeared. 7 years earlier, while Jones was being questioned about the robberies, his own wife told investigators something that changed the entire direction of the case. She said her husband had confessed to her years before that he had killed Kari Lynn Nixon. Facing serious federal prison time himself and hoping that cooperation might help reduce his wife's sentence for her role in the robberies, Jones agreed to talk. His attorneys reached out to authorities and told them he had information about the Nixon case. What followed was a confession that laid out in chilling detail exactly what had happened that night. Jones told police that he had been 23 years old at the time. He said he had seen Kari at the store that night while he was buying beer, and that, fueled by anger over problems in his own marriage, he made the decision to abduct her. He forced her into his car at gunpoint and drove her to a remote family cabin outside of town, a place most people in the area would have had no reason to ever think twice about. There, he held her for hours. When it was over, he tried to strangle her. When that failed, he shot her. The next morning, while the sun rose over a town that had absolutely no idea what had happened in its own backyard overnight, Robert Jones dug a shallow grave in the woods near that cabin and buried Kari's body. And then he simply went on with his life. 3 years later, in 1990, he moved his own family back to the Au Sable Forks area and settled into a home only about 200 yards from where Kari's body lay buried. For years after that, while the Nixon family and the entire town continued to search, put up flyers, and pray for her safe return, the man responsible for her death was living a short walk down the road, raising his own 2 children in that same community, and every year he took his family on a picnic to that same wooded spot. Not out of guilt, not to grieve. He went back summer after summer to check whether the ground had been disturbed. It's one thing to imagine a killer as some distant stranger who strikes once and disappears forever, someone you'll never have to think about walking past at the grocery store. It's an entirely different thing to picture him spreading a blanket over the exact patch of earth where he buried a 16-year-old girl, unpacking sandwiches for his own children a few feet away from where hers had been left. On January the 28th, 1994, as part of a plea agreement, Robert Jones led state troopers to that wooded area himself. There, after nearly 7 years, they finally found Kari Lynn Nixon. Buried alongside her remains were the groceries she had purchased that final night, a small, heartbreaking detail that closed the loop on exactly how her ordinary errand had ended. The final chapter of Kari's case did not come with a dramatic courtroom trial. It came with a confession and a carefully negotiated plea deal. In exchange for that confession and for leading investigators to Kari's body, and in an arrangement that would also keep his wife out of prison for her role in the robberies, Jones was sentenced to 18 years to life for Kari's murder. Because that sentence was served concurrently with the 15 years he was already serving on the federal robbery charges, it meant he might end up serving only a handful of additional years specifically for taking Kari's life. Prosecutors were frustrated by the arrangement, but they believed it was the only realistic way to guarantee a conviction and, more importantly, to finally bring Kari home to her family. In the years since, the community around Au Sable Forks has consistently and fiercely opposed Jones's release every time he has come up for parole. He has been denied multiple times, and an appeal of his conviction was also rejected by the courts. For the Nixon family, confirming Kari's death didn't end their grief. It simply began a new, quieter chapter of it. Her brother passed away years later, at the very same age Jones had been on the night he took Kari's life. He had named his own daughter after the aunt she would never get to meet. Kari's parents also passed away in the years that followed, but not before establishing a scholarship fund in her memory, so that her name would continue to stand for something good, long after they themselves were gone. This case has stayed with people for almost 4 decades now, not because of the crime itself, but because of the distance. 200 yards between a family's picnic blanket and a grave they claimed for 7 years not to know was there. A few hundred feet between a girl walking home safely and a girl who never made it. 5 minutes that separated an ordinary Tuesday night from a mystery that would take almost 7 years to solve. That's the story of Kari Lynn Nixon, a girl who walked to the store for her father one summer night and never made it back. And a truth that stayed buried in plain sight, closer than anyone in that town ever imagined.